All right, today we are diving deep, and I mean that literally, right into our planet's surface. We're going to uncover the incredible geological stories behind how lakes even form in the first place. It's really a tale of immense force, super slow transformation, and at the end of the day, just the simple need for a place for water to gather. So have you ever looked at a lake and just wondered, why here and not, a few miles over there? What's the secret? Well, it all comes down to the creation of a basin, basically a giant depression in the land. And today, we're going to explore the incredible variety of forces that can sculpt these massive bowls.
So here's our game plan. We'll start with the absolute basic recipe for any lake. Then we'll get into the really cool stuff, the forces that create them, from deep inside the earth to the action on the surface, and even from water itself. We'll also touch on human-made lakes before we wrap it all up with a quick review. Let's get into it.
Okay, first things first. Before you can have a lake, you absolutely need one thing. You need a basin. It is the one essential ingredient.
It sounds almost too simple, right? A lake is just water in a hole. But the really crucial part, the part that tells the whole story, is how that hole, that basin, actually got there. That's where things get really fascinating.
Let's start with the most dramatic lake makers of all. We're talking about immense forces that come from deep within our planet. These are the tectonic and volcanic processes that can quite literally rip continents apart.
Tectonic lakes are born from the sheer power of the Earth's crust as it moves, cracks, and pulls apart. See, when these massive plates shift around, they can create incredibly deep depressions that, over millions of years, fill up with rainfall and groundwater.
This slide shows us exactly how it happens. It all starts with stage 1, stress. The crust gets pulled apart by tension. Then, in stage 2, you start to see cracks or faults develop. And finally, this is the key part. A whole central block of land just drops down. That process is called subsidence, and it creates this perfect, deep, steep-sided depression, an ideal basin for a truly massive lake.
And if you want to get a sense of the scale we're talking about, just look at Lake Baikal in Siberia. It's the world's oldest and deepest rift lake, and it is so vast that it holds about 1/5 of all the world's fresh surface water. That is the kind of power we're talking about with tectonic action.
Okay, next up, volcanoes. And as you can see here, there are 3 main types of volcanic lakes. First, you've got crater lakes, which form right in the volcanic vent pretty soon after an eruption. Then there are caldera lakes. They form way later when the volcano's huge, empty magma chamber collapses in on itself. And finally, maar lakes. These are created by a super violent steam explosion when hot magma hits groundwater. And see those terms, polygenetic and monogenetic? That just refers to the volcano's life story. Polygenetic means it erupts many times, while monogenetic is kind of like a one-and-done eruption. All right, so we've looked deep inside the Earth. Now let's come back up to the surface and see how the forces acting right here can be just as powerful when it comes to sculpting basins for lakes. Glaciers are incredible landscape artists. Seriously, as they move, they push up these enormous piles of rock and dirt called moraines. These moraines can act like natural dams, trapping all the meltwater. Sometimes a giant chunk of ice gets buried, and when it finally melts, it leaves behind a round hole called a Kettle lake. And a fjord? That's just a valley that a glacier carved out so deep it actually went below sea level. Now, the way a landslide lake forms is, well, it's a lot more sudden and dramatic. It's really simple. A massive amount of rock and earth just comes crashing down, completely blocking a river. The water has nowhere to go, so it just starts backing up, creating a brand new lake right there behind this natural dam of debris. This next part might sound a little strange, but sometimes the best thing for creating a place to hold water is water itself. Let's take a look at how that works. This is just a classic, beautiful geological story. You've got a lazy river meandering across a flat plain, making these big, wide loops. Over time, the river erodes the land, making the loops wider and the little neck of land between them narrower and narrower. Then, one day there's a big flood, and the river takes a shortcut. It just punches straight through that narrow neck. And just like that, the old loop is cut off, abandoned, leaving behind this perfect crescent-shaped Oxbow lake. In this case, water acts more like a chemical. See, rainwater is slightly acidic, and over thousands of years, it can actually dissolve soft rock like limestone. This creates huge underground caves. Eventually, the roof of one of those caves gets too thin and, whoop, it collapses,
forming a sinkhole on the surface. That sinkhole then just fills with water, and you've got yourself a lake.
So what makes a salt lake so salty? It's actually a pretty simple recipe, but it needs very specific conditions. First, you need a closed basin. Water can flow in, but there's no river for it to flow out. The only way water can escape is through evaporation. So as the sun bakes down and evaporates the pure H2O, all the salts and minerals that were carried in get left behind. Over thousands of years, that concentration just builds and builds, creating a super salty or hypersaline lake.
And that brings us to our final category. This is the newest and probably the fastest growing type of lake formation on the planet, and it's driven by us.
An artificial lake, which we usually call a reservoir or an impoundment, is pretty straightforward. We build a massive dam across a river, and the land behind it is intentionally flooded. This creates a huge body of water that we can then use for all sorts of things, like generating hydroelectric power, irrigating farmland, or supplying drinking water for big cities.
All right, we've covered a ton of ground, from the center of the Earth to its surface and back again. So let's do a quick recap of the major forces that go into making the world's lakes.
So, to boil it all down, we can really group these natural lake makers into three main buckets. First, you've got forces from deep inside the Earth, that's your tectonics and volcanoes. Second, you have actions happening right on the surface, like glaciers and landslides. And third, you've got processes driven by water itself, whether it's carving a new path or dissolving rock.
Okay, time for a little knowledge check. A deep lake formed by a block of the Earth's crust dropping down between two faults is called a... That would be a tectonic or rift valley lake. Exactly.
All right, next one. What's the main difference between how a crater lake and a caldera lake are formed? The key is timing and what's actually happening. A crater lake forms in the volcano's vent pretty soon after an eruption, while a caldera lake forms from a whole magma chamber collapsing, usually long after.
And for the last one, that crescent-shaped lake, the one that gets left behind by a winding river, is known as an Oxbow lake. You got it.
You know, in the end, every single lake you see is really just the final chapter of an incredible geological story. It's a story of fire and ice and immense pressure and just time. They're like these beautiful monuments to the forces that are always constantly reshaping our world. So the only question left is, which story will you explore next?